A racist flight attendant punched a black teen in the throat, leaving him gasping for air. Seconds later, his father stood up, pulled out a badge, and something far more dangerous. What happens next will leave you speechless. He threw his fist at a child's throat, watching him faint, certain no one would fight back. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. It wasn't a dramatic crash, not yet, just a small, sharp clink of water spilling across the white linen of the first-class tray table. Desmond Keller's reflexes were fast. His hand shot forward, steadying the glass before it tipped entirely. A few drops slid down the cuff of his dark blazer, soaking the edge of his sleeve. He dabbed them away calmly with a napkin, his face betraying nothing but composure. Across the narrow aisle, however, Travis Hume, the flight attendant responsible for the service, stood rigid with an expression that seemed polite on the surface but carried something harsher beneath. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, and his eyes narrowed, as though the simple accident had confirmed a judgment he had already made. Jordan, Desmond's 10-year-old son, leaned closer to his father, lowering his voice into a whisper only Desmond could hear. "Dad, he's staring again." His small hands clutched at the straps of his backpack, the one stuffed with puzzle books and a journal where he liked to draw. His dark eyes darted nervously toward Travis, then back to his father. Desmond shifted, resting a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. His tone was low and steady, carrying the same weight he used in corporate boardrooms when diffusing tension. "Some things are not worth reacting to, Jordan. Let it go." Yet even as he spoke, Desmond felt the weight of the moment pressing deeper. Travis's stare lingered, and though his lips pulled into the faintest imitation of a smile, his eyes carried no warmth. Instead, they glimmered with a restrained disdain, sharpened like a blade but hidden behind the gloss of professionalism. He adjusted his tie and stepped forward as though nothing had happened, yet the silence he left behind spoke louder than words. The cabin itself seemed to feel the tension. Passengers glanced sidelong, curious but unwilling to intervene, their gazes slipping away quickly as if the sight of the black father and son in the luxury of first class made them uneasy. Overhead, the hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft prepared for takeoff, vibrations thrumming through the seats like a subtle warning. The world beyond the windows was calm, flashing lights on the runway, workers guiding baggage carts, but within the cabin, unease rippled unseen. Desmond turned his focus back to Jordan, noticing how the boy had curled into him, resting his head gently against his father's shoulder. He felt the child's body relax slightly, the way children trusted their fathers to anchor them against the unknown. But Desmond also knew what Jordan had sensed. The man's stare was not random. It carried intention, a kind of simmering contempt that needed no words. As Travis passed again, collecting empty glasses from the row ahead, his elbow brushed too close against Desmond's arm. The contact was unnecessary, almost deliberate. "Careful," he said smoothly, though the comment had no clear context. His tone was just polite enough to escape reproach, yet the smirk at the corner of his mouth betrayed the satisfaction he felt in making his presence known. Desmond did not respond. Years of discipline had taught him when to hold back. But inside, he measured the situation carefully, as he always did. In the boardroom, silence was sometimes the most powerful answer. But on this flight, trapped in a cabin with nowhere to move, it felt like silence might be mistaken for weakness. He told himself again, this was just a journey, nothing more. His objective was clear, and he would not allow petty hostility to distract him from reaching that corporate summit. Still, the irony pressed against him like turbulence. He had come seeking peace for his son, and yet peace seemed to be the very thing slipping out of reach. Jordan stirred, pulling out his puzzle book and trying to focus, but his small voice broke through again. "Why does he keep looking at us like that?" The words were soft, trembling with an unease far too heavy for a boy his age. Desmond tightened his arm around his son. "Because some people don't understand what they see," he answered quietly, his eyes fixed forward. His voice was calm, but his chest tightened with the weight of truth. From a few rows behind, another passenger coughed lightly, filling the silence. Papers rustled, a seatbelt clicked shut, but Desmond could feel every detail sharpening, the way Travis's footsteps struck the aisle with clipped precision, the way his eyes flickered back again, pretending to scan the cabin while always returning to their row. The mask of civility was still in place, but Desmond knew masks had limits. His mind replayed the spilled water, the too close brush of an elbow, the smirk at Jordan's unease. They were small things, yes, trivial in isolation, but woven together, they carried a darker rhythm. He had built his life on reading signals others ignored, and these signals were clear. This man wanted to provoke him. Desmond's fingers tapped once on the armrest, a steadying gesture as much as a calculation. He would endure it. He had endured worse in conference halls, in negotiations, in subtle exclusions dressed as policy. He had no intention of letting his son witness anger in him, not today. And yet, as he glanced at Jordan's worried face, he felt the sting of dramatic irony. His restraint might not be enough, not against a man determined to break it. The engines roared louder as the aircraft finally lifted from the ground, carrying them skyward. The cabin tilted gently, city lights falling away beneath the windows. Jordan's head remained against his father's shoulder, his breathing evening out, though the unease in his posture lingered. Desmond exhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts. Across the aisle, Travis adjusted a serving cart, his movements too precise, too practiced, his eyes darting once more toward the father and son before sliding away with a practiced indifference. Yet in that glance was something dangerous, something Desmond could not ignore. The journey ahead would not be peaceful. He knew it now, as surely as he knew the ink on his corporate proposal. This flight was no longer a simple path to a summit. It was becoming something else, a test of composure, of dignity, of a father's patience in the face of cruelty. And in the quiet hum of the cabin, with Jordan drifting against him and Travis's presence looming ever closer, Desmond could not shake the feeling that the air itself had shifted. The foreshadowing was undeniable, a storm waiting just beyond the clouds. Neither father nor son knew the sky itself would turn into a courtroom. Travis's arm brushed too close to Jordan's seat as he moved down the aisle, the tray in his hand rattling against the metal edge. The sound was sharp in the hushed cabin, drawing a glance from Desmond, who raised his hand slightly. "Excuse me, could I have some water for my son?" he asked, his voice calm, controlled, yet laced with quiet authority. Travis's smile flickered for a second, then curved into something closer to disdain. He leaned in just enough for only Desmond to hear and muttered, "Special treatment, of course." The words carried no warmth, only a sting of sarcasm, before he turned his back with a practiced pivot. Jordan accepted the glass when it finally arrived, his small fingers trembling around the cool rim. He took a sip, but the water caught in his throat, sending him into a brief fit of coughs. His face reddened as he struggled to clear it. Instead of offering assistance, Travis paused at the end of the aisle, turned his head slightly, and smirked. "Children should learn discipline," he said under his breath, not loudly enough to command attention, but sharp enough for Desmond to catch every syllable. Desmond's jaw tightened. He forced his expression into stillness, lowering his gaze to the document spread across his lap. Numbers, charts, and projections blurred together as he focused on maintaining composure. He knew the summit awaiting him demanded clarity, not distraction. Yet the unease pressed at the edges of his calm, like a storm gathering at sea. Jordan shifted uncomfortably beside him, pretending to focus on the puzzle book resting across his knees. His pencil hovered above the page, scratching lightly but never solving. His eyes flicked toward Travis each time the man passed, as though the puzzle in front of him no longer mattered compared to the looming figure of the attendant. Travis, for his part, seemed almost energized by the silence. He moved with deliberate slowness past their row, rolling his eyes with exaggerated flair, his sighs heavy, his body language dripping with contempt. When Desmond lifted a hand once more, quietly requesting a meal tray for Jordan, Travis ignored him entirely, pivoting sharply toward another passenger and pretending not to notice. A whisper ran through the cabin. Two men across the aisle glanced at each other, their voices hushed. One muttered, "He didn't even give the boy his tray." The other shook his head quickly, pulling his magazine higher, as if reading could shield him from responsibility. The other passengers followed suit, lowering their gazes, tightening their lips. Pretending not to see was easier than intervening. Desmond leaned slightly toward Jordan. "Focus on your puzzle," he whispered, his voice low but steady. "Some things are not worth your attention." He stroked his son's shoulder gently, but he could feel the boy's small frame trembling beneath his palm. The minutes crawled on, each movement by Travis another provocation. A tray slammed harder than necessary, a napkin tossed instead of placed, a glance lingering just long enough to carry meaning. The entire cabin seemed to sense the current, though no one dared to name it. Desmond's calm composure, the armor he had carried through countless meetings, contracts, and negotiations, was tested with every passing moment. Finally, Jordan stood. It was a small, timid gesture. He only wanted to stretch his legs to shake away the tension that knotted his body. His eyes darted toward his father, searching for reassurance, and Desmond gave a small nod. But before the boy could step into the aisle, Travis was there. The attendant's arm shot out, barring the path like a gate. His forearm hovered inches from Jordan's chest, blocking him with an authority that carried no justification. The smirk on his face deepened, his eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that felt almost rehearsed. Jordan froze, confusion flashing across his face. "I just wanted to stand for a second," he said softly, his voice caught between politeness and fear. His eyes flicked to his father, wide and uncertain. Desmond straightened slowly in his seat, his posture calm yet commanding. His voice was low but firm. "Remove your arm." Travis didn't move. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, just enough for Desmond to catch the faintest curl of a mocking smile. His silence said more than words. A dare, a provocation, a test of boundaries. The passengers who had tried to ignore the situation now felt the weight of it pressing into their chests. Some shifted uneasily, others watched with wide eyes. A young man near the back lifted his phone discreetly, beginning to record, sensing that the moment was teetering on the edge of something greater. Desmond's hand rested on Jordan's shoulder, guiding his son gently back into his seat. He could feel the boy's shallow breaths, the rapid flutter of his heart. Calm words formed on his tongue, but behind them, fury coiled tight. His objective remained the same, to protect his son, to keep peace where peace seemed impossible, yet he understood with bone-deep certainty that the quiet before them could not last. The aisle felt smaller, the air heavier. The unspoken tension filled every corner of the cabin, wrapping itself around passengers like invisible chains. No one knew what would come next, but everyone knew something would. Travis leaned back, finally withdrawing his arm, but not before flashing a look of mock triumph. His smirk lingered as he turned, as though daring Desmond to challenge him further. And in that moment, Desmond understood. The game of subtle provocations was over. The line had been crossed, and there would be no retreat. The quiet before the storm had ended. Now, foreshadowed danger was on the verge of bursting. The mask of politeness was seconds from shattering. The eruption came suddenly and brutally. Jordan coughed again, a small strained sound that carried down the hushed aisle, and whispered, "Dad. Water." His voice was fragile, like glass about to shatter. Without warning, Travis leaned forward, his shadow falling over the boy's seat, and in one shocking, unprovoked act, he drove his fist directly into Jordan's throat. The sound was muffled but sickening, a dull thud against flesh that sent a shiver through the cabin. Gasps erupted immediately, sharp intakes of breath from passengers who could not believe what they had just witnessed. Jordan collapsed back against his seat, his small body jerking as he clutched his neck with both hands. His eyes widened, round with terror, as air refused to come. His breaths were jagged, shallow, desperate gasps that made his chest rise and fall in frantic rhythm. His lips parted, but no sound came out, only the harsh rattle of a throat crushed by violence. His face flushed crimson, panic radiating through every trembling motion. Desmond's heart stopped. The world seemed to fracture around him. The notes on his lap, the quiet hum of the engine, the whispers of passengers, all of it blurred into a deafening silence. All he saw was his son's face, choking, suffocating, fading before his eyes. His hands trembled as he reached toward Jordan, his instincts warring between lifting his son to help him breathe and turning toward the monster who had just done this. "Jordan, stay with me," Desmond pleaded, his voice tight, breaking. His hand hovered helplessly above his son's shoulder before he pressed gently against his chest, as though his touch alone could draw air back into the boy's lungs. His breaths grew quick, ragged, his mind torn apart by fear and rage. Passengers rose in their seats, some covering their mouths, others fumbling for phones. One man stammered, He hit the kid." His voice quivered with disbelief. Words shaking as though saying them out loud made them more real. Travis, standing with his shoulders squared and jaw set, shifted his expression into a mask of innocence. His lips curled slightly at the corner, the faintest smirk betraying his satisfaction. "He'll be fine," he muttered dismissively, as if nothing more had happened than a spilled drink. His tone carried a cruel edge, daring Desmond to react, mocking the father's restraint. Desmond's chest tightened, his pulse thundered in his ears. Years of boardroom battles, negotiations where patience had been his weapon, seemed meaningless now. His son's fragile breaths were slipping away, and all he could think was, "If I do nothing, he dies." The thought repeated like a drumbeat, pushing reason aside, pulling raw instinct to the surface. "Help him!" another passenger shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. But no one moved. Fear froze them in place. Some recorded, their hands shaking as their phones captured every detail, the boy gasping, the father trembling, the attendant looming with cruel calm. Dramatic irony spread thick across the scene. Desmond, who had boarded this plane determined to keep his son safe and quiet, was now faced with the very opposite. The man who had only wanted peace for his child was thrust into a nightmare where peace was impossible. Jordan's body slumped, his eyes fluttering as dizziness overtook him. Desmond felt the weight of his son's limp form pressing against him, every shallow gasp pulling the father closer to despair. His hand moved to the boy's forehead, whispering softly, "Don't you leave me, son. Stay with me." His voice cracked, a raw mixture of love and desperation. Travis leaned back slightly, crossing his arms as though the moment was beneath him. His smirk lingered, but his eyes narrowed with a dangerous challenge. "What? You going to do something about it?" His words were quiet but sharp, slicing through the stunned silence of the cabin. Desmond's jaw clenched so tight it ached. His hands shook violently, not from fear, but from the storm building inside him. He looked at Jordan, his boy's chest rising in uneven gasps, and then back at Travis, whose arrogance dripped like venom. The stakes shifted instantly, crashing down on him with crushing weight. This was no longer about a business trip or the summit waiting in another city. This was no longer about contracts, deals, or company reputation. This was about life and death. Passengers whispered urgently, "Call the captain. Get the police ready on landing. That man just attacked a child." Their voices swirled, but no one dared step between Desmond and Travis. The air was thick, every breath strained with tension, as though the very plane had been sealed in dread. Desmond's thoughts spun wildly. Should he leap across the aisle? Should he cry for help? Trust that someone else would save his boy? But every second ticked louder in his head, every cough from Jordan weaker than the last. His reason shouted for restraint, but his instincts screamed louder. And in that terrible moment, with the cabin watching in frozen disbelief, Desmond realized he was standing at a precipice. His son's life hung by a thread, fragile and fleeting. His own control, the years of measured patience that defined him, hung just as precariously. One move could save Jordan, or doom them both. The boy's shallow gasps, the father's trembling hand, the steward's cruel smirk, all of it collided into a storm that promised no peace. The boy's breath hung by a thread, while the father's control hung by a choice. Chaos surged through the cabin. Passengers rose half out of their seats, some shouting for help, others calling desperately for the captain, but the narrow aisle felt like a cage with no escape. The man at the center of it all, Travis Hume, did not flinch beneath the storm of voices. He folded his arms across his chest with deliberate arrogance, his chin tilted as if the cries of fear and outrage were nothing more than noise. His words fell like venom into the silence that followed. "Kids should learn discipline," he muttered, his tone sharp, dismissive, and cruel. Desmond Keller lowered himself beside his son, his arms wrapping Jordan's frail frame as though sheer will could protect the boy from further harm. Jordan's breaths came in ragged stutters, each gasp weaker than the last. Desmond pressed his fingers gently against his son's throat, searching desperately for steadiness, for proof that life had not already slipped away. The faint rise and fall beneath his fingertips ignited both relief and terror. Relief that Jordan still clung to breath, and terror that it was fading fast. The cabin's luxury, its polished wood accents and cushioned seats, had dissolved into a battlefield of survival. Passengers whispered frantically, torn between horror and expectation. Some clutched their phones, trembling hands recording the unfolding nightmare. Others covered their mouths, too shocked to speak. Their eyes betrayed the same truth. They were waiting for Desmond to act. The weight of their stares pressed against his back like invisible hands, urging him toward a decision that no boardroom or summit had ever prepared him for. Desmond's mind became a storm of fury and fear. He was a man who had built his life on composure, on patience in the face of provocation. Yet now, staring at his child's limp body, Those years of discipline clashed violently with the primal instinct roaring inside him. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the chaos around him. For the first time in his life, the rules of diplomacy and restraint felt like shackles rather than shields. "Stay with me, son," Desmond whispered, his voice shaking, his lips close to Jordan's ear. His words carried both a command and a plea, as if his sheer determination might bind his son to the world. Jordan's faint cough rattled, and the boy's eyes flickered, half closed, straining to remain open. Desmond's chest burned with helplessness, a sensation he had sworn never to feel again after years of clawing his way to the heights of power. Across from him, Travis smirked, the shadow of satisfaction twisting across his face. He leaned casually against the galley partition, utterly blind to the fury he had unleashed. His stance was defiant, his expression daring. He seemed certain that no one would touch him, that his uniform was armor enough to shield him from consequence. "You people think rules don't apply to you," he added under his breath, the words dripping with contempt. The sentence lodged deep in Desmond's chest, stoking a fire already raging. His vision blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from the sheer weight of choice. If he remained still, his son might die before the plane touched the ground. If he acted, the consequences would be irreversible, echoing far beyond the walls of the aircraft. Yet logic cut through his panic like a blade. Waiting was no longer an option. Hidden beneath his tailored jacket, heavier now than ever before, was the pistol he carried. It was no impulsive choice, no reckless indulgence. It was permitted under his security clearance, part of a life where danger often waited in shadows. In countless situations it had remained untouched, a safeguard he hoped never to use. But tonight, in this narrow aisle, it whispered to him like a verdict already written. Passengers exchanged frantic whispers, their voices low but urgent. "He has to do something. The boy's not breathing right. Someone stop that man." Yet no one moved. Their fear was not of Desmond, it was of Travis, of his violence, of what further cruelty he might inflict. All eyes turned again to the father, as though he alone carried the power to restore balance. The weight of judgment pressed closer, suffocating him even as he tried to breathe for his son. Desmond straightened slowly, his hand still resting protectively on Jordan's chest. The world around him narrowed into fragments, the shallow breaths of his child, the sneer of the man who had struck him, the anxious silence of strangers waiting for justice. Years of leadership had taught him to see angles, to calculate risks, to choose battles, but this was not business, nor politics. This was blood, breath, and the raw edge of survival. Travis scoffed, his voice loud enough for those nearest to hear. "What's the matter? Can't handle a little lesson? Maybe the boy will remember next time." His words cut through the air like glass, brittle and sharp. Desmond's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding under the strain of restraint. A passenger across the aisle whispered urgently, his voice trembling, "Sir, please, help him." The plea was not for Jordan alone. It was for the father himself, for a man forced to bear a choice too heavy for any soul. Desmond's breath grew steady, not from calm, but from resolve. The storm within him crystallized into focus. He could no longer weigh his reputation against his son's life, nor balance morality against legality. His objective had shifted beyond titles, beyond contracts, beyond the billion-dollar summit waiting at the journey's end. His objective was simple, undeniable: protect his son at any cost. The cabin lights flickered faintly as the plane cruised through turbulent air, casting shadows that danced across Desmond's face. Every movement, every whisper, every shifting shadow felt like a foreshadowing of a reckoning to come. The cruel punch had torn away the mask of civility, and now the scales of justice tilted precariously in his hands. He rose halfway from his seat, his back straight, his gaze unyielding. Jordan's faint wheeze still echoed at his side, fragile proof that there was still time, if only seconds. Desmond's hand brushed the inside of his jacket, where steel and resolve waited side by side. He had not yet drawn the weapon, but the decision was already written in his heart. Passengers leaned back, their bodies tense, their eyes locked on him. The air thickened, silence pressing in, the hush of expectation louder than the earlier shouts. They did not speak, but their stares shouted what they dared not say. The father would act, and the sky itself would bear witness. Travis smirked once more, arrogance blinding him to the storm gathering in front of him. His arms remained folded, his expression one of mockery, as though he still believed himself untouchable. But in the faces around him, in the trembling gasps of a child, in the resolve sharpening in his father's eyes, the truth glared back. The cabin was no longer a vessel of travel. It was a stage, a courtroom, a crucible of morality, power, and justice, and all of it pointed toward a single moment. Every eye turned toward the father, waiting for a verdict written in seconds. Desmond rose slowly. His body felt as though it were moving through water, every muscle tight, every nerve alive with rage and fear. The air inside the cabin was thick, suffocating, as if every passenger's breath had been stolen away and replaced with silent expectation. Jordan lay slumped in the seat, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven gasps. His lips were pale, and his hands trembled weakly as they pressed to his throat. The sight carved into Desmond's soul like a blade. His mind screamed at him to act, and yet his body, for one suspended moment, stood frozen between the instincts of a father and the composure of a man who had spent his life walking the line of restraint. Travis stood just feet away, arms crossed with a smirk stretching across his face. The arrogance in his posture, the way his chin tilted slightly upward, made him appear untouchable in his own mind. He had no fear, no recognition of what he had done. Instead, his voice cut the silence with cruel precision. "What's the matter?" Travis taunted, his tone dripping with condescension. "The little prince can't handle a lesson?" The words sliced through Desmond's restraint like glass shattering. His jaw tightened. His hands trembled not with hesitation but with a fury that had been caged for too long. He had endured the glares, the muttered insults, the denial of simple decency. But this was different. This was his son's life. Corporate boardrooms had taught him how to hold silence, how to wield patience as a weapon. But no boardroom could prepare him for this moment. Passengers sat rigid in their seats, wide-eyed, their knuckles white as they gripped armrests. A few lifted trembling phones to record, their lenses glowing faintly as though history itself demanded a witness. Others buried their faces, whispering hurried prayers. The cabin lights flickered gently above, casting a dim glow that made every shadow seem sharper, every movement heavier. Desmond's hand slid beneath his jacket with deliberate control. The weight of the pistol was there, cold and unforgiving against his palm. It felt heavier than it ever had before, as though it carried not only metal, but the burden of every decision he had ever made. His breaths came slow, steady, measured, but each one carried the heat of his fury. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out the distant hum of the engines. He pulled the weapon free, his motion smooth, honed from years of careful practice. Gasps echoed through the cabin like ripples on still water. The metallic glint of the pistol under the overhead lights caught Travis's eyes, but even then, the man scoffed. His smirk widened into something close to mockery, his voice dismissive, dripping with disdain. "You're not going to use that," Travis sneered. "Men like you, too worried about reputation. Empty threats." Desmond's voice, when it came, was low but resonant, carrying across the cabin like a verdict. "Step back." The command was sharp, precise, and undeniable. Yet Travis only chuckled under his breath, tilting his head as if he were the judge in this grotesque theater. His arms remained folded, his posture radiating contempt, daring Desmond to prove him wrong. Jordan stirred faintly, a weak, broken sound catching in his throat. The boy's hand twitched as though reaching for his father, though his eyes fluttered, too dazed to remain open. Desmond's heart broke and hardened in the same instant. The sound of his son's struggle sealed the decision. The silence thickened, every second stretching into eternity. Passengers leaned forward, their breaths held, knowing they stood at the edge of something irreversible. Dramatic irony hung heavy. All the years Desmond had spent mastering control, perfecting patience, meant nothing here. His life's discipline stood against the raw instinct of a father, and instinct was winning. Desmond steadied his hand, his finger resting firmly along the side of the weapon, then curling with quiet certainty toward the trigger. His eyes locked on Travis's, unblinking, unwavering as though drilling into the very arrogance that dared to mock his child's pain. Travis smirked one final time, his mouth opening to deliver another insult, but the words never came. The shot rang out, sharp and thunderous, splitting the pressurized air of the cabin. The crack echoed against the walls, reverberating through every seat, every breath, every soul on board. The recoil jolted Desmond's arm, but his stance held strong, steady. Travis's body jerked violently as the bullet struck, his smirk vanishing, his arrogance dissolving into shock. He staggered back against the galley wall, eyes wide, before collapsing with a hollow thud. For a moment, the cabin froze. The world seemed suspended in silence, passengers caught between gasps and screams. Phones slipped from hands, coffee cups toppled from tray tables, and the quiet hum of the engines became the only sound daring to intrude. Desmond lowered the weapon slowly, his chest heaving, his focus never straying from Jordan. His son lay limp but alive, his breaths shallow, fragile. Desmond dropped to his knees beside him, one hand clutching the pistol, the other trembling as it brushed Jordan's cheek. The boy's faint warmth against his palm steadied him, anchoring him in the storm. His lips pressed together as he swallowed back tears, refusing to break in front of the world watching him. Every eye in the cabin fixed on him. Passengers stared at the man who had just transformed from a calm, composed executive into a father who had unleashed his fury. Some saw a savior, others saw a criminal, but all recognized that the air itself had changed. This was no longer a flight. It had become a courtroom suspended in the sky, and in that courtroom, the verdict had been delivered in the sharp crack of a single shot. In one deafening instant, justice rewrote itself in the sky. The gunshot cracked through the cabin, its thunderous echo ricocheting off the metal walls like a storm trapped in a box. Travis jerked backward, his smirk dissolving into a lifeless gape as his body slammed against the galley wall. His eyes, moments ago sharp with arrogance, glazed over and fixed on the ceiling in a hollow stare. For an instant, the entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Passengers gasped, some screaming, others clutching their seats in disbelief. Phones dangled mid-air, recording hands trembling as if even technology could not keep pace with what had unfolded. The thick, pressurized air now felt heavy with smoke, fear, and something unspoken, a recognition that this was more than violence. It was a father's desperate choice carved into reality with a single bullet. Desmond stood frozen, the pistol still raised in his hand, his knuckles white against the grip. His chest heaved violently, breaths shallow and uneven, sweat dampening his collar despite the chill of the cabin. His gaze locked onto Jordan, slumped against the seat, his small chest rising with weak, irregular breaths. The boy's lips were pale, his throat bruised where the cruel punch had landed. Desmond's body trembled, torn between rage and terror, between the image of the man he had just killed and the boy whose life hung by a thread. Slowly, as though gravity itself weighed him down, Desmond lowered the gun. The metal clinked softly against the floor as he let it fall from his hand, the sound almost inaudible compared to the pounding of his heartbeat in his ears. He dropped to his knees beside Jordan, scooping him gently into his arms. His fingers pressed against his son's throat, searching frantically for a pulse. For a breathless second, there was nothing. Then, faint but steady, the rhythm beat beneath his fingertips. Relief surged through him so fiercely it nearly broke him. Tears burned in his eyes, but he forced them back, pressing his forehead against Jordan's hair. "Stay with me, son," he whispered, his voice shaking, barely audible over the muffled sobs of passengers. "Everything will be all right. You hear me? Everything will be all right." His words were steady, but his hands betrayed him, trembling as they stroked Jordan's hair. Around them, the cabin had dissolved into chaos. A man in the next row muttered prayers under his breath, rocking in his seat. Another passenger fumbled with his phone, whispering into it as though broadcasting history. A teenager near the back raised his camera higher, catching every angle, his face pale and horrified. And yet, amid the hysteria, a strange silence wrapped itself around Desmond and his son, as though the world acknowledged that this moment belonged to them alone. 2 flight attendants stood frozen at the far end of the aisle, their eyes wide, their bodies rigid with fear. They exchanged frantic glances, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Neither dared approach, the weight of the pistol's echo still lingering in the air. Their hesitation was not cowardice, but instinct. The man who had pulled the trigger was not a stranger or a criminal in their eyes, but a father who had crossed a line for reasons they could not yet untangle. Desmond's thoughts spun in relentless circles. He had built an empire by staying calm under fire, by reading the currents of chaos and bending them to his will. But here, in this narrow tube of metal hurtling miles above the ground, instinct had swallowed reason whole. He had not been a CEO, not a strategist, not even a leader. He had been only one thing, a father. and the world, he knew with a cold certainty, would never see him the same way again. He lifted his head, eyes darting across the rows of passengers. Dozens of lenses pointed his way, unblinking, capturing his every movement. There was no hiding, no chance of this moment vanishing. Each flash of light from a phone screen burned into his vision like a reminder. This act would not stay here in the sky. It would descend with them, magnified, judged, and dissected. Jordan stirred faintly, a shallow cough rattling through his chest. Desmond held him tighter, whispering words of comfort that sounded more like prayers. His relief was tempered by dread. He could feel the weight of foreshadowing pressing down on him, telling him that the worst was yet to come. The bullet had stopped a monster, but it had also unleashed a storm he could not yet see. One man in the cabin finally spoke, his voice sharp, breaking the silence. "He saved that boy," he said firmly, his trembling finger pointing toward Desmond. His declaration echoed, hanging in the air, but no one else responded. Some nodded, others turned away, unwilling to be drawn into judgment. The line between protector and killer blurred in every pair of eyes that met Desmond's. Desmond shut his eyes for a moment, drawing in a shaky breath. He could already sense the walls closing in, the questions, the accusations, the trials that awaited him once the wheels touched the ground. But here, in this fleeting moment, none of it mattered. Only Jordan mattered. Only the fragile pulse beneath his hand, the faint rhythm of life, kept him tethered to the world. The cameras kept rolling. The attendants stayed frozen. And Desmond, his suit now stained with sweat and his son's faint tears, sat in the aisle cradling what mattered most. He knew the silence around him was not peace. It was judgment waiting to be delivered, consequences waiting to unfold. Foreshadowing seeped through every heartbeat, every whisper, every trembling breath in the cabin. What had been decided in a split-second act of desperation would not end here in the clouds. It would follow them down, drag them into courtrooms, headlines, and history. Yet in that moment, Desmond shut it all out. He pressed his lips to Jordan's forehead, whispering once more that everything would be all right. Whether or not it was true, he needed his son to believe it. The silence after the shot was louder than the gun itself. The captain's voice broke through the chaos, the words sharp and tense as they filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are making an emergency landing. Please remain calm and stay seated." His tone, though controlled, carried a strain that made every passenger sit a little straighter, their eyes darting from the ceiling speakers to the man who now embodied both fear and protection, Desmond Keller. The hum of the engines grew heavier in the silence that followed. Some passengers sobbed softly into their hands, while others whispered with trembling lips about trials, prison cells, and the headlines that would surely follow, but amidst the ripple of panic, no one dared rise to confront him. Desmond sat back in his seat, his arms wrapped tightly around Jordan's frail body. He rocked his son gently, as if the rhythm alone could coax breath back into the boy's lungs. His cheek pressed against the crown of Jordan's head, and he whispered faint assurances into his ear. "I'm here. You're safe. Just breathe for me." The words were more for himself than for the child, but they steadied his heart for a moment. The pistol lay discarded on the floor, kicked aside by a passenger who had acted in fear rather than aggression. It rested just out of reach, its black frame reflecting the dim overhead lights. Yet the presence of the weapon lingered in every mind on board. It was no longer the object that mattered, but the act it had carried out, an act that no passenger could erase from memory. Desmond's mind replayed the shot again and again, not as a sound, but as a feeling. The recoil in his arm, the ringing in his ears, the sharp silence that followed. Across the aisle, a man with trembling hands leaned forward and whispered to another, "He saved the boy." "I swear he did." His words shook, his eyes locked on Desmond as though speaking louder might draw dangerous attention. The other passenger nodded but kept his gaze down, his lips pressed tight. Another voice from the back broke through the quiet murmur, harsher in tone. "It doesn't matter what the reason was." He pulled a trigger mid-flight. The world's not going to forgive that. The clash of whispers grew into a current of unease, passengers divided not by what they had witnessed, but by how they chose to interpret it. Desmond heard every word, though he pretended not to. His focus was on Jordan, on the shallow rise and fall of his chest, on the faint rasp that broke with each strained breath. His thoughts moved with ruthless clarity. the same way they did in a boardroom when billions were on the line. But this was no negotiation, no contract. This was life, raw and unyielding. He pressed his lips to Jordan's forehead, his whisper breaking as he murmured, "No boardroom, no contract, no empire, none of it matters more than this." The jet tilted slightly, the descent beginning. The pressure in the cabin shifted, a low rumble vibrating beneath the seats. It felt to Desmond as though the earth itself was pulling him down faster than gravity, as if judgment were rushing up to meet him. He looked around, seeing the faces of strangers etched with fear, with curiosity, with judgment. Some avoided his gaze, others held it with a mixture of respect and horror. The irony was cruel and clear. The man who had just fired a gun aboard an aircraft was, in that moment, the only figure they trusted to keep them safe. The silence was broken again when a passenger across the row leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "You did what you had to do. Don't let them twist it." His eyes were steady, though his hands shook on the armrest. Desmond gave the man a single nod but said nothing. His silence was not agreement or denial. It was the weight of everything pressing on him at once. As the plane descended further, the foreshadowing in every glance became unbearable. Desmond could almost hear the future. Reporters demanding explanations, prosecutors dissecting his choices, board members questioning his integrity. He could see the headlines already, stripped of context, stripped of truth. They would not write of the boy gasping for air, or of the father torn between restraint and survival. They would only write of the shot, the echo that still lingered in the cabin. Jordan stirred faintly in his arms, his fingers curling weakly into his father's sleeve. The small gesture shattered Desmond's composure more than the chaos of the past minutes. His chest tightened, his eyes burning, but he held back tears with the stubborn dignity that had carried him through a lifetime of battles. He kissed his son's forehead again, speaking softly enough that only Jordan could hear. "Everything I have, everything I am, it's yours. Just stay with me." The hum of the engines deepened as the runway loomed near. The cabin shook lightly, trays rattling in their locked positions, passengers gripping armrests as if bracing for impact. Whispers grew into a wave, some laced with sympathy, others with condemnation. The tension pressed into Desmond's skin like 1,000 invisible hands, each one a reminder that the moment the plane touched ground, judgment would no longer be confined to whispers. The jet dipped lower still, and time itself seemed to slow. Desmond could hear the beat of his own heart louder than the roar of the engines, feel the weight of his son heavier than all the years of leadership he had carried. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself not as a CEO, not as a man of power, but simply as a father. His arms tightened around Jordan one last time before the wheels screamed against the runway. Passengers gasped, some clutching their seats in relief, others bracing for the unknown that waited outside. Desmond did not move. He held his son steady, whispering a final vow under his breath. The landing was not an end, only the beginning of something larger, something far beyond his control. The ground was rushing up, carrying judgment with it. He left a black kid gasping for air, thinking silence would protect him. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. When the wheels screeched against the tarmac, the cabin jolted with the rough landing, but no one breathed a sigh of relief. Instead, an eerie hush hung in the air, broken only by Jordan's faint, uneven breaths as Desmond clutched him tightly. Blue and red lights pulsed through the oval windows, cutting across passengers' pale faces in flashes. Outside, law enforcement vehicles roared up the runway, surrounding the aircraft like predators closing in on prey. The moment the engines slowed, the heavy thud of boots echoed along the jet bridge, followed by the sharp clatter of weapons being readied. The reality struck all at once. This was no longer just a flight, it had become the scene of a crime. The cabin door burst open, and armed officers stormed in, weapons drawn high, their voices overlapping in stern commands. "Hands up! Everyone! Hands where we can see them!" The passengers obeyed almost instinctively, arms rising with trembling fingers, fear rippling through the first-class section like a contagious fever. Some shouted over the noise, their voices breaking in desperation. He saved his son! He was protecting the boy. Others shrank back into their seats, eyes darting between Desmond and the lifeless body of Travis still sprawled near the galley. Desmond did not raise his hands. He could not. His arms were wrapped around Jordan, his grip unyielding, as though letting go would mean losing him forever. His heart thundered as he pressed his cheek to his son's hair, whispering softly, "Stay with me, son. Just breathe." His voice cracked, stripped of the authority that once filled boardrooms, carrying only the trembling weight of a father's fear. The officers hesitated, their rifles still trained on him, yet uncertainty flickered in their eyes. This was no wild aggressor. They saw a man hunched protectively over his fainting child. One officer shouted again, voice louder, harsher, "Sir, put your hands up now." The command cut through the tension, but even as Desmond turned his head toward them, his arms never left Jordan. "Please," he pleaded, his words spilling out in urgent desperation. "Help my son first. He can't breathe. Please, look at him." His eyes burned with a mixture of rage and despair, veins straining against his temples. The plea did not match the figure of a gunman the officers had been briefed about. For a moment, their own training warred with the reality unfolding before them. Around them, passengers found their courage. A man in a business suit stood halfway from his seat, raising his voice above the chaos. "I saw everything. That flight attendant attacked the boy, punched him in the throat. The father had no choice." His face was flushed, sweat dripping down his temple, yet his words struck like a hammer. Others chimed in from their seats, voices rising in shaky unity. "He saved his kid," another shouted. "He was protecting his son." These scattered declarations shifted the atmosphere, pressing doubt into the minds of the officers. Still, not all passengers spoke. A few kept their heads low, eyes wide with fear, their silence heavy with self-preservation. Some exchanged nervous glances, whispering under their breaths about courtrooms and headlines. Dramatic irony swirled through the scene. Desmond's life had been spent mastering narratives, shaping perceptions, and controlling outcomes, but here, in this cabin-turned theater, he had no voice. The cameras in raised hands had already decided what story would reach the world. At last, an officer stepped closer, his weapon lowered slightly, though his voice remained firm. "Sir, we need you to cooperate. Put the child down, we'll get him help." Desmond's jaw clenched. The instinct to shield Jordan overpowered every command. "No," he said firmly, his voice deep and unshaken despite the tremor in his body. "You will look at him first. You will help him first." The defiance stunned them, not because it was shouted, but because it was spoken with a calm certainty, the same tone that once sealed billion-dollar deals. The standoff could not last. Slowly, cautiously, two officers advanced, their eyes softening as they caught sight of Jordan's limp frame. They gestured to a medic waiting just behind them. But procedure demanded restraint, and Desmond knew it. He met their gaze, the weight of inevitability pressing on his shoulders. He would not leave this cabin a free man, but perhaps his son would leave it alive. "Sir, we're placing you under arrest," the officer announced, his tone steady, rehearsed, yet not without a trace of hesitation. Desmond closed his eyes briefly, exhaling as though sealing away every boardroom victory, every carefully planned future. He gently shifted Jordan into the arms of a waiting medic, his hands lingering until he felt the boy's faint pulse against his fingertips. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his empty palms, surrendering to the moment. Cold metal tightened around his wrists, the click of the handcuffs echoing louder than the gunshot that had started it all. He did not resist. Instead, his eyes followed Jordan being carried down the aisle, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Passengers watched in silence, their expressions torn between admiration, fear, and sorrow. Phones remained raised, capturing the image of a once untouchable CEO shackled in a narrow aisle seat. As the officers guided him firmly into position, Desmond's mind turned to the irony, how his greatest battles had been waged with contracts and strategy, yet here he sat defeated by fate itself. He lowered his head, the lights of the emergency vehicles painting him in alternating flashes of red and blue, symbols of judgment closing in. The man who once commanded boardrooms now sat shackled in an aisle seat, awaiting judgment not from shareholders but from fate. At the terminal, chaos exploded into headlines within minutes. Sirens howled beyond the runway, and flashing red and blue lights turned the airport facade into a storm of color. Reporters swarmed the glass windows, microphones thrust upward, their voices tumbling into rapid-fire commentary. Within the confines of the secure holding room, however, silence pressed thick against the walls. The contrast between the roaring world outside and the stillness inside was suffocating. Desmond Keller sat rigid on a metal chair, his wrists weighed down by blood-stained cuffs that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. His tailored suit, once a symbol of control and authority, now carried wrinkles, sweat, and the faint smear of his son's blood. His breathing was steady, but behind his calm exterior his thoughts churned with relentless intensity. Every heartbeat seemed to echo the truth. The trial he now faced had already begun long before he set foot in this room. Across the table sat Detective Roland Strick, a man seasoned by years of interrogations. His sharp eyes, framed by a weathered face and streaks of gray hair, scanned Desmond like a hawk studying prey. Strick's reputation was one of blunt honesty, a man who cut through excuses and stripped away masks. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep and unyielding. "Why carry a firearm on a commercial flight, Mr. Keller?" he asked, leaning forward so that the table creaked beneath his weight. His tone was not openly hostile, but each word was loaded with accusation, as though daring Desmond to justify the decision that had turned a passenger cabin into a stage for life and death. Desmond met his gaze without flinching. His voice was low, steady, deliberate, an echo of boardroom negotiations honed over years. "Because threats follow me, Detective. I've been targeted before, and security clearances permitted me to carry. But this time, it wasn't about me. My son's life was slipping away before my eyes." The words were precise, his tone controlled, yet beneath them lay the raw tremor of a father's anguish. His hands, though bound, curled into fists against the steel table as though replaying the moment over and over. Strick tilted his head, his sharp eyes narrowing. "But why shoot?" he pressed. "Why not restrain the man? Why not call for assistance?" His fingers tapped the edge of the case file resting in front of him, each tap striking like a drumbeat of judgment. His expression gave nothing away, but his questions sliced at the fragile boundary between justification and guilt. Desmond inhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the wall behind Strick as if replaying the cabin scene. His voice quivered with contained rage, though his words remained precise. "Because my son could not breathe. Every second counted. I saw his face turning pale, his chest heaving with nothing left to draw. Restraint would have taken time we didn't have. I acted, not as an executive, not as a man with options, but as a father. He was dying." His eyes returned to Strick's with a fire that no restraint could mask, and for a brief moment the detective's stern facade faltered. The silence between them was cut by the distant echo of voices outside the room, reporters calling Desmond's name, cameras clicking, and news anchors debating his actions in real time. Their words slipped faintly through the walls. Reckless, hero, dangerous precedent. The entire world was already split into factions, yet here, Desmond sat in stillness, caught between those narratives. Dramatic irony weighed heavily. He had built his career controlling stories, crafting legacies, and now he was powerless as others shaped his fate. A knock at the door broke the tension, and a young officer entered quietly, whispering into Strick's ear. The detective nodded, his face softening only slightly before dismissing the officer. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, and studied Desmond again. "Your son is alive," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Doctors say he's stable, though his throat is bruised and he'll need time to recover. His voice may be weak for a while, but he'll pull through." Relief washed over Desmond like a wave crashing through stone. His body sagged in the chair, his eyes closing briefly as he whispered a prayer under his breath. The faint rhythm of Jordan's pulse replayed in his mind, the lifeline that had anchored him in that moment of chaos. He opened his eyes, and a single tear glistened before he forced it back. "Thank you," he murmured, though the gratitude was not for Strick but for the unseen doctors fighting for his boy's recovery. Strick's gaze softened for only a heartbeat before hardening again. "Witnesses support much of your account," he said, his voice now quieter, almost thoughtful. "Several passengers recorded the incident. They confirm the attendant struck your son. They confirm you warned him before firing. But you need to understand, Mr. Keller, the court may see this differently. The law does not bend easily, and public opinion—" He let the words trail off, his hands spreading slightly as if to illustrate the weight of the storm outside. "Public opinion can crush a man, no matter what the witnesses say." Desmond's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing with the realization. He knew Strick was right. The evidence might protect him in a courtroom, but the endless cycle of news clips, debates, and opinion pieces would shape him into whatever narrative served best. Some would call him a reckless gunman. Others would call him a father who saved his child. Both stories would live, but only one would decide his fate. Leaning forward, Desmond spoke with a calm that belied the storm inside him. "Detective, I've spent my life mastering perception. But this is beyond control. They will paint me as villain or hero, and neither is the truth. I am only a father who refused to watch his child die." His words hung heavy in the sterile air, and for a moment even Strick seemed at a loss for reply. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the clock on the wall ticked mercilessly, and the noise of reporters outside grew louder, as if the walls themselves could not hold back the weight of the world pressing in. Strick finally exhaled, his tone somber, his words a warning and a verdict all at once. The true trial had only just begun, and it would not be fought in silence. The conference room lights burned brightly against the midnight hour, yet no one on Desmond Keller's legal team looked tired. The incident on the plane still echoed in everyone's mind, especially his. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, shoulders tense, his tailored jacket folded neatly over the back of his chair. Malcolm Veyer, his lead attorney, leaned forward with sharp intensity, papers spread before him like pieces of a chessboard. His voice cut through the silence with a deliberate calm that only heightened the urgency of his words. "Desmond, listen carefully. You saved your son, but the law doesn't measure actions by intent alone. The law will demand answers, every bullet, every second, every choice you made." Malcolm's hands moved as he spoke, his fingers stabbing the table for emphasis. His gray eyes, usually unreadable, glimmered with urgency. Desmond said nothing at first, his gaze fixed on a glass of untouched water before him. His reflection trembled on the surface, distorted, as if echoing the way his carefully built life now quivered on the edge of collapse. He drew in a breath, steady but heavy, before finally speaking. "I did what I had to do. Jordan's life was fading in front of me. No man, no law, would have stood there and done nothing." His voice was controlled, but beneath it lay a current of fury and grief. Another lawyer, a junior associate named Rylan Cortez, interjected nervously, adjusting his tie as he spoke. "But the airlines team is already spinning this. They're preparing to paint Travis as a misunderstood employee. They're saying you acted like a reckless gunman." His words seemed to sting the air, and the young man's eyes flickered toward Desmond with equal parts fear and admiration. Malcolm's hand sliced through the tension. "They will try, but we won't let them. We have witnesses, we have testimonies, and most importantly, we have evidence." He pulled out a tablet and pressed play. The screen showed raw, shaky cell phone footage. Travis refusing service, blocking Jordan's path with smug defiance, his smirk cold and unmistakable. Gasps from passengers could be heard in the background, followed by fragments of arguments and Desmond's own calm but desperate pleas for help. The room watched in silence, the weight of the video pressing against every heart. Then Malcolm switched the clip, this time showing an edited version already circulating online. In it, the beginning was cut, and the video started with Desmond raising his voice, his arm visible near his jacket. Travis's earlier provocations had been erased, replaced by a story of sudden violence. The lie was slick, designed to inflame. Desmond's jaw tightened as he leaned forward, his fists curling against the polished table. "They've twisted the truth." His words were low, almost a growl, his eyes sharp with both disbelief and rage. "That's what they do," Malcolm said, leaning closer. "They are not just fighting us in court, they are fighting us in the court of public opinion. And right now, that court has no rules." He paused, then added, "This isn't just a legal case, Desmond. This is a war of narratives. And you, of all people, know how powerful a narrative can be." Desmond's thoughts spun back to boardrooms and stages, to moments where he had shaped markets with his words. Yet now, all that skill felt hollow. He had no control over these edited clips, these headlines screaming his name with words like killer and reckless. For the first time, he realized he was not the one holding the pen that wrote the story. At that moment, his phone vibrated on the table. The name on the screen made his heart leap. Jordan. He snatched it up, pressing it to his ear, his voice softening instantly. "Son?" A faint, hoarse voice answered, barely more than a whisper. "Dad? I'm not afraid anymore." The boy's words carried a fragile strength, the kind only pain can forge. Desmond closed his eyes, his chest tightening. His hand shook slightly as he gripped the phone tighter, as though holding on to his son's voice could anchor him against the storm. His throat burned, but he forced his voice steady. "Rest, Jordan. That's all you need to do. Leave the rest to me." When he ended the call, the room was silent again, every eye on him. His team could see the change in his face, the raw pain still there, but hardened into something sharper. Malcolm recognized it immediately. "You see it now, don't you?" he said. Desmond nodded slowly, his gaze no longer on the glass of water or the flashing screen, but on the horizon of what must be done. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's not about my freedom or my reputation or even the company. It's about making sure no father, no child, ever has to face this again." The lawyers exchanged glances, some nervous, some inspired. Desmond's words carried more than conviction. They carried resolve. He was no longer simply defending himself, he was declaring a new mission. Malcolm leaned back, a small flicker of approval in his eyes. "Then we fight not just to protect you, but to change the skies themselves." The conference room seemed to shift in that moment, the weight of tragedy transforming into the gravity of purpose. Desmond's world had narrowed to a single truth. His son's life had been nearly stolen in front of him, and the only way forward was to ensure no one else would ever know that pain. As the night deepened and strategies were laid out like weapons on the table, Desmond felt the storm inside him calm, not because the danger had passed, but because his path was now clear. The courtroom would decide guilt, but Desmond's mission was already clear: turn tragedy into reform. The gavel struck once, its sharp crack silencing the murmur of the packed courtroom. All eyes turned to the front as the trial of Desmond Keller began, a case that had already stirred the nation. Desmond sat at the defense table, his posture straight but his hands clasped tightly, betraying the storm within. Across from him, the prosecution wasted no time. They rose with practiced confidence, their tone sharp and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lead prosecutor declared, his voice carrying through the chamber, "this case is not about grief or sympathy. It is about a man who allowed fury to override reason, a man who had alternatives, restraint, de-escalation, even delay, but chose a bullet instead." The words struck the room like arrows, piercing through the silence. The jury shifted uncomfortably, some leaning forward, others narrowing their eyes as if weighing the statement already. The defense, seated quietly, let the accusations hang in the air. Desmond kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight, his mind replaying the moments again and again. The punch, Jordan's gasp, the collapse. He wanted to speak, to tell the world what it had felt like in that instant, but his time would come. For now, the courtroom belonged to narratives, and the prosecution was eager to frame him as a man who had chosen vengeance instead of reason. "He could have restrained the assailant," the prosecutor pressed, pointing directly toward Desmond. "He could have called for assistance. Instead, he drew a gun and fired, ending a man's life in cold blood." The defense rose immediately, their lead attorney Malcolm Veyer commanding the space with his steady presence. His voice cut through the tension with a quiet authority. "What the prosecution calls cold blood was, in reality, a father's desperate choice in a matter of seconds," he began. "Seconds in which his son's life was slipping away." The words drew murmurs from the gallery, where journalists, activists, and curious onlookers crowded the benches. Malcolm paced slowly, his hand resting on the rail of the jury box. "You will hear from witnesses who saw the cruelty firsthand. You will see footage, unedited and undeniable, of the events that led to that moment. And you will ask yourselves, what would you have done had it been your child gasping for air?" The first witness called was a passenger named Leon, a middle-aged man with weary eyes who gripped the edge of the stand as if it anchored him. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as he recalled what he had seen. "The attendant," he said, pointing toward the prosecution's empty chair reserved for Travis's memory, "taunted them from the start. He refused service, mocked the boy, and then he hit him." His hands shook as he gestured to his own throat. "He punched that child right here. The boy couldn't breathe. He was turning red." His voice cracked, emotion spilling into the silence. The prosecution tried to chip away, asking whether Leon might have misinterpreted what he saw. Leon's jaw tightened. There was nothing to misinterpret. He hit him. The child collapsed. The courtroom stirred, whispers spreading like ripples across a pond. Desmond watched, his heart heavy, both grateful for the man's courage and tormented by the memory being spoken aloud. Next came video footage, gathered from passengers' cell phones. The lights dimmed slightly as the screens illuminated the courtroom. Grainy, yet powerful, the recordings showed fragments. Travis smirking as Desmond requested water, Jordan clutching his throat, Desmond leaning forward in panic. Gasps filled the room as the punch came into view on one angle. Travis's arm lashing out, Jordan's small frame recoiling. The jury flinched, some covering their mouths. Dramatic irony hung in the air. The world had already seen these clips online, debated them on screens and in living rooms, but here, in this room, the weight of law gave them a different gravity. The defense brought forward another witness, a young man named Arlen, who had sat just a few rows behind Desmond. His testimony cut through the prosecution's careful framing. "The father begged him to stop," Arlen said firmly. "I heard it. He said, 'Please, my son can't breathe.' He wasn't trying to fight. He was trying to save his child." The boy, Jordan, sat nearby in the courtroom, silent, his small figure beside a nurse. His presence alone seemed to fill every corner of the chamber with unspoken truth. Each juror glanced at him at least once, their eyes softening as they took in his pale face and the faint scar along his throat. The airline's attorneys, working alongside the prosecution, scrambled to maintain control. They presented documents suggesting Travis had been under stress, portraying him as a man pushed to breaking point. They hinted at Desmond's wealth, his firearm, his influence, suggesting he had acted with arrogance rather than necessity. But each testimony unraveled their crafted image, each piece of footage struck down their argument. The truth, though fractured in video and memory, came together as one undeniable picture. Desmond himself sat silently, his mind split between the present trial and the haunting memory of that flight. Every sound in the courtroom seemed magnified, the shuffle of papers, the click of shoes, the scratching of pens. He felt the weight of his choices pressing against him like a physical force, but he also felt something else: resolve. He knew that whatever the outcome, this trial was more than his freedom. It was a mirror reflecting the cost of cruelty, the desperation of a father, and the thin line between justice and judgment. As the day's session drew to a close, the atmosphere in the courtroom was suffocating with tension. The jurors leaned back in their seats, the gravity of testimony etched across their faces. The prosecution gathered its files tightly, lips pressed in frustration. The defense exchanged glances of quiet determination, aware that momentum was shifting, but knowing the battle was far from over. Jordan's quiet presence lingered like a living reminder of what had truly been at stake. The judge's gavel finally struck, signaling adjournment, but no one moved immediately. The echoes of voices, the images from the screens, and the trembling words of witnesses still hung in the air, pressing down on every soul in the room. Desmond exhaled slowly, his hands unclasping for the first time all day. His eyes moved toward Jordan, and in that moment father and son shared a silent exchange, one of resilience, one of truth unspoken but understood. Every word spoken in that room carried the weight of a life saved and a life lost. The courtroom doors swung open with a loud creak, startling the rows of spectators into silence. A single figure stepped forward from the back, nervous, hesitant, but purposeful. Colin Ray, a junior flight attendant barely in his mid-20s, clutched a folder so tightly that the papers inside seemed ready to crumple beneath the weight of his trembling hands. The eyes of the jury, the judge, the prosecution, and the defense all turned toward him at once. The air in the chamber shifted, a collective awareness that something irreversible was about to unfold. "I have something to say," Colin announced, his voice shaking yet carrying enough weight to echo across the still room. The judge adjusted his glasses, narrowing his gaze with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "Step forward, Mr. Ray," he instructed, his tone steady but with a tinge of anticipation. Colin swallowed hard, the knot in his throat visible, and slowly approached the witness stand. Desmond Keller sat frozen in his chair, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles whitened. He had not expected this young man to appear, and for a brief moment he wondered if Colin was another pawn of the prosecution, a planted voice meant to twist the narrative. But the way the junior attendant avoided the prosecution's eyes, the way he fixed his gaze on the judge as though speaking directly to justice itself, told Desmond otherwise. Something inside the CEO stirred, hope, fragile yet burning. When Colin took the oath and sat down, the silence in the room deepened into a palpable weight. His fingers brushed over the edges of the folder, and his shoulders rose and fell as if each breath was a battle. "I worked alongside Travis Hume," Colin began, his voice trembling but clear, "and I cannot stay silent any more." The prosecution immediately objected, arguing that the witness had not been disclosed beforehand. But Malcolm Veyer, Desmond's lead attorney, rose with calm authority, countering that a whistleblower's testimony could not be suppressed if it bore relevance to the truth. After a tense deliberation, the judge leaned forward, eyes piercing through the silence. "Proceed," he commanded. Colin opened the folder with unsteady hands, pulling out a stack of documents marked with the airline's crest. He held them up for the court to see. "These are internal memos," he said, his voice gaining strength with every word. "Memos about Travis Hume, records of multiple passenger complaints, complaints about aggression, verbal abuse, even racial slurs, all of them buried, all of them dismissed by management to avoid scandal." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward, eyebrows arched in shock. The spectators whispered frantically, their voices carrying a storm of disbelief. Even the judge's composure faltered for a moment as he raised his brows, scanning the documents that were handed to him. Desmond's heart pounded in his chest. Every word from Colin felt like a stone smashing through the walls the prosecution had built. His mind replayed Jordan gasping for breath, the smirk on Travis's face, and now these buried truths. It was no longer just a father's word against an airline, but a revelation that systemic negligence had paved the path to tragedy. The prosecution tried to regain ground. "Mr. Ray," their lead attorney pressed, his voice sharp as steel, "are you aware that by presenting these documents you are violating company confidentiality agreements? Are you not simply a disgruntled employee trying to tarnish a colleague's memory?" Colin's jaw tightened, and for the first time his eyes flared with conviction. "I am aware," he said, leaning forward. "I am also aware that a boy almost lost his life because a man with a history of violence was allowed to keep working in first class. I may lose my job. I may never work in aviation again, but I will not live with silence knowing what I know." His voice cracked, but it carried the force of honesty that no cross-examination could undo. The tension in the courtroom sharpened into something electric. Passengers who had testified earlier turned their heads toward Colin with expressions of relief, as though his words had finally validated what they felt but could not prove. Malcolm seized the moment, rising from his chair with deliberate calm. He spoke not with the fire of an argument, but with the gravity of truth. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, gesturing toward the stack of memos, "this is not about a single moment in the sky. This is about a pattern of negligence, denial, and concealment that allowed a dangerous man to continue serving passengers until tragedy struck. Mr. Keller was not facing an ordinary flight attendant. He was facing the consequence of an airline's failure." Desmond's chest tightened as he listened, his eyes flicking toward Jordan, seated quietly at the back of the courtroom with a nurse. The boy's fragile frame, his healing throat, became the unspoken evidence that tied every word together. This wasn't only about what Desmond had done, it was about what the airline had refused to do. The judge shuffled through the papers, his expression unreadable but stern. The jury scribbled furiously on their notepads, and the prosecution sat in uneasy silence, their strategy unraveling before their eyes. Colin lowered his gaze, exhaustion settling into his shoulders, but relief softening his face. He had chosen the harder path, the one lined with risk and consequence, yet it was the path that carried truth. For a fleeting moment, Desmond caught Colin's eye and gave him a slight nod, a silent thank you, a recognition that his courage had shifted the balance of the trial. The defense sat taller, the courtroom crackled with new energy, and the prosecution, for the first time, looked cornered. What had begun as a fight to justify one man's desperate action was now evolving into the exposure of a system that had hidden its flaws behind polished uniforms and corporate walls. The moment lingered like a thunderclap, and as the documents lay open on the judge's bench, there was no pulling them back into the shadows. The truth had escaped its confinement. The truth that was buried in files now stood blazing in open court. The courtroom was hushed, every sound magnified by the heavy silence that clung to the air. The prosecution had just finished, their words still echoing in the jurors' minds. "No man is above the law." The line lingered like a shadow, an accusation that seemed to hang over Desmond Keller with a weight no title or fortune could deflect. All eyes turned toward the defense table where Malcolm Veyer, Desmond's attorney, rose with steady composure. His steps toward the jury box were deliberate, his dark suit catching the sharp glare of the courtroom lights. He clasped his hands behind his back, his voice carrying not just authority, but urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Malcolm began, his tone firm yet edged with emotion. "You have heard the prosecution repeat the same refrain. A man died. Yes, that is undeniable. But I ask you, do not forget why that death occurred. Do not forget the moment that boy," he pointed gently toward Jordan, sitting weak and pale in the gallery, "could not breathe." His voice cracked just slightly, betraying that he too carried the weight of this trial as more than just a case. This was not a calculated act of malice. It was the split-second decision of a father who saw his child slipping away. The jurors shifted, some leaning forward, others folding their arms tightly as if bracing themselves against the force of his words. Malcolm let the silence between his statements stretch, making each one land like a hammer blow. He paced slowly, his shoes clicking against the polished wood, and then he leaned on the edge of the jury box, lowering his voice so they had to lean in. "Think of your own children, your nephews, your brothers. If you saw them gasping, if their small hands clawed for air, what would you have done? Would you have waited for policy? Would you have weighed corporate rules? Or would you have acted?" His eyes moved deliberately across the jurors, holding their gaze until each one faltered or looked down. The prosecution objected lightly, calling it an appeal to emotion, but the judge waved it aside. The words had already taken root. Malcolm pressed forward, his voice rising now, filling the chamber with conviction. "This is not just about Desmond Keller, the CEO. This is about Desmond Keller, the father, a man who, in the face of cruelty, had no choice. You saw the videos. You heard the testimonies. Travis Hume's fists struck a 10-year-old boy. His throat was crushed, his breath nearly stolen. And what did the system do before that moment? It allowed Travis to serve unchecked, despite complaint after complaint buried by his employer." He turned sharply, his hand slamming down on the defense table for emphasis. "This system failed. It failed Desmond. It failed Jordan. And in that failure, a father acted when no one else would." The jurors exchanged glances now, some with furrowed brows, others with eyes glistening faintly. The weight of responsibility settled over them like a cloak, binding them to the truth that this was no ordinary case. Malcolm allowed the tension to linger, then took a step back, his voice softening. "Do not punish the man for saving his son. Do not punish a father for doing what every one of you would have done." He returned to his seat, but the silence was not empty. It was charged, alive, brimming with unspoken questions. Then, to the shock of the room, Desmond himself rose. The scraping of his chair against the floor sounded louder than the gunshot that had started it all. The courtroom stilled again. Even Malcolm, surprised, leaned back and allowed his client to take the floor. Desmond walked forward, his movements slow but firm. His face carried no arrogance, only exhaustion etched into every line, but his eyes held a calm fire. Standing before the jury, he clasped his hands together to steady their slight tremor. His voice came low at first, but every syllable carried across the room. "I am not here as a CEO," he began, his words deliberate, "and I am not here to defend the name of my company. I am here as a father who saw his son struck down, his breath fading, his eyes rolling back as though the life was leaving him." His voice wavered, but he drew in a deep breath, forcing steadiness. He raised his gaze directly to the jurors, meeting each pair of eyes without flinching. "I acted because I had no other choice. I acted because in that moment, nothing else mattered, no contract, no fortune, no reputation, only my son's life." A hush spread through the courtroom so deep that the ticking of the old wall clock could be heard. Desmond's chest rose and fell heavily as he spoke again, this time louder, more resolute. "And I tell you this with no hesitation. I would do it again. If it meant saving him, I would do it again. A father cannot stand idle while his child is destroyed before his eyes. You may judge me, you may call me reckless, but know this, I stand by what I did because it was the only way to bring my boy back to breath." The words struck the room like a stone breaking still water. Some jurors sat frozen, others shifted uncomfortably, but none could look away from him. The prosecutor scribbled notes furiously, though his clenched jaw betrayed the recognition that the tide was shifting. Desmond let his hands fall to his sides, his voice softening one last time, trembling but steady enough to leave its mark. "I am not proud of what happened, but I will never regret protecting my son." The silence that followed was unbearable, the weight of truth pressing on everyone present. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, his stern face betraying the faintest glimmer of empathy. The jurors, caught between law and humanity, stared at the man before them. Not the CEO, not the defendant, but the father. And as Desmond returned to his seat, the entire courtroom remained still, knowing they had just witnessed not strategy, not legal maneuvering, but the raw truth of a man with nothing left to lose. The final word was not spoken by a lawyer, but by a father who had nothing left to lose. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their footsteps heavy against the wooden floor, each echo tightening the tension that hung in the air like a taut string. Desmond Keller sat rigid at the defense table, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles whitened, his eyes fixed on the foreman who carried the weight of his fate. Jordan sat close by, his small frame dwarfed by the polished benches, his wide eyes shimmering with both fear and hope. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the rustle of papers and the uneven breaths of those awaiting the decision. Every juror's face seemed unreadable, masks of solemn duty that gave nothing away. Malcolm Vayer, Desmond's attorney, leaned forward slightly, his jaw tense but his voice steady as he whispered, "Whatever happens, remember, you acted to protect." "All rise," the judge commanded, his voice sharp and commanding, slicing through the silence. Desmond stood, his height and composure unshaken despite the storm raging inside him. Jordan's small hand clung tightly to his father's sleeve, trembling with unspoken fear. Desmond glanced down at him briefly, forcing a reassuring nod, though inside he felt his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might betray his calm exterior. The jury foreman cleared his throat, unfolding a sheet of paper with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor. "We, the jury, find the defendant." The pause stretched endlessly, every second a blade slicing deeper into the tension. "Not guilty." The words struck the room like a thunderclap. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by murmurs of disbelief and cries of relief. Jordan's body collapsed against his father's arm, tears streaming down his cheeks as he sobbed openly. Desmond bent down, wrapping his son into a protective embrace, his composure finally cracking as his own eyes shimmered with emotion. His chest heaved, and for a fleeting moment, the world around him faded. There was only Jordan's fragile voice whispering, "You're safe now, Dad." Relief washed through Desmond like a tide, but the courtroom itself was far from calm. The prosecution scowled, their papers clutched with frustration, while the defense exhaled in quiet triumph. Yet Desmond felt no victory. Instead, he felt the enormity of what had just happened settle on his shoulders. The whispers in the gallery shifted quickly from relief to debate, some praising the justice delivered, others muttering fears of a precedent that blurred the line between protection and violence. The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Order," he barked, though his own eyes flickered with a human recognition of the storm beyond his bench. Desmond straightened, his hand resting firmly on Jordan's shoulder. The boy's tears had not stopped, but there was strength in the way he clung to his father. Malcolm leaned in once more, his voice lower now. Protesters clashed in opinion, some holding signs declaring Desmond a hero, others shouting warnings about vigilantism. The air carried the heat of argument, the sound of history being written in real time. Desmond shielded Jordan with his arm as they stepped out, flanked by supporters and attorneys, every camera lens capturing their faces. He kept his head high, though the roar of voices crashed around him like a storm tide. Reporters shouted questions. "Do you regret pulling the trigger? Do you think this ruling endangers future cases? Mr. Keller, are you a hero or a criminal?" Desmond paused only once, lifting his gaze above the chaos, his face solemn. "I acted to save my son," he said, his voice steady, each word carrying a weight that silenced the crowd for a heartbeat. "No father should be punished for protecting his child." His words rippled outward, fueling headlines that would dominate the nation. In the days that followed, the impact grew beyond Desmond himself. Lawsuits hammered the airline from every corner, exposing negligence that had once been buried. Settlements loomed, and policy reforms were demanded. But Desmond did not fade quietly back into the world of corporate boardrooms. He saw in his son's eyes the cost of silence, the danger of leaving such battles to others. With the same determination that had built his empire, he redirected his influence, pouring resources into a nonprofit dedicated to passenger rights and accountability in the skies. He called it Sky Shield, a name that symbolized the protection he wished every family could rely on when they traveled. The mission gave Desmond a new sense of purpose. He spoke at conferences, at schools, and in interviews, his voice steady but never boastful. He did not dwell on the shot fired, but on the vow born from it. At home, Jordan's laughter slowly returned, though the memory of that flight lingered in his hoarse voice and the way he sometimes flinched at sudden noises. Desmond held him close during those moments, knowing that healing was not instant but earned over time. Months later, as he sat in his office overlooking the city, Desmond reflected on the path that had brought him here. The glass windows framed a horizon that seemed endless, a reminder of the skies that had both scarred and reshaped his life. He touched the edge of his desk, where a framed photo of him and Jordan smiling sat proudly, a testament to survival, to love, to purpose. In interviews, when asked to summarize the ordeal, he no longer spoke as a CEO calculating outcomes, but as a father who had lived through the storm. "I acted as a father, not a CEO," he would say, his voice low but firm, and every father deserves the right to protect his child. What began in blood ended in reform, turning tragedy into a legacy of justice. Seconds later, the father stood tall, and the flight attendant's power vanished on the spot. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, abuse of power, and the violent consequences of unchecked prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic discrimination, provoke thought about accountability in public spaces, and inspire action toward justice, safety, and dignity for all.